How's everybody doing today? This is Pete here at the Spawn HQ, and we are about to attempt something that has only slightly been done before, and we're going to let you guys in on it and see what you can come up with too. So here we have the new Spawn Polliwog tail, and this is fluorescent pink. And if you look in the vise today, we do not have a hook. Instead, we have a needle, and this is one that has a little bit of a flat edge on two sides, and the purpose for that is usually to go through a tougher material like leather or something like that. But what we're going to do is actually pierce this tail in theory, and it doesn't have to be exactly in the middle or anything else, but it does have to hold. So go ahead and pierce the end there. Oh, that's not going to get it. There we go, like so. And if you notice on these Polliwog tails, there's a thinner, more tapered end, and then there's usually one end that's not quite as thin or tapered, and that's the end that I want to tie onto the fly. So for what we're about to do, I'm going to use this thin, slightly more tapered end, and I'm not going to use a lot of pressure when I start this. And I've got some Danville 210. This is their fluorescent pink, but all I'm going to do is grab onto that tail a little bit, and this is similar to the method you would use if you were tying an extended body, be it for a hopper or mayfly or anything like that, and then you'd be familiar with this part anyway. So we're just going to get some thread wraps as a base on our tail, and of course everything at this point is attached to that needle, so we're not using a ton of pressure. This is all about holding and positioning and getting ready for our next element. So I have a Nature Spirit Spey Marabou feather, and this is dark turquoise or kingfisher blue. And what I'm going to do is get rid of this nasty stuff here at the bottom of the feather. I don't want to use any of that from either side. Match up both sides. Now what I've done is given myself a little working area here. I get as many fibers lined up as I want, and then extend them out to the side. Get one good pinch and pull down while you pull the quill up, and you'll remove those fibers just fine. So there you go. It's got some fibers lined up. When this is done, these are going to come off the back side of that tail. However, for now, we're going to tie them toward what would be the hook point if this were or the bend of the hook if there were a hook in the vise. So let's get this one tied in, and all I'm looking for here is to keep it on the top half of this needle shank, if you will, like so. Just work it around a little bit, and that's what we're looking at. A couple more thread wraps back here, and so there's two passes, one forward, one back. Nothing crazy on the tension, just enough to hold everything in place. And let's get rid of that one. And let's turn this bad boy over. And as far as, like, you know, when we pierce this tail, I guess technically you wouldn't have to. I do like to, just so I've got a little more freedom with my hands. I'm going to grab a thread. I'm going to change that position as it, you know, I want it exactly right here and all that good stuff. So as far as you could technically get around this, if you don't want to pierce that tail with the needle, by all means, feel free not to. And all I'm going to do now is repeat the step of peeling off some fibers of this Marabou. And we're going to place these on the bottom portion. And all we're looking for here is to match our first portion as far as where the fibers end. Like about so. And repeat. A couple soft wraps. We'll manipulate these fibers now a little bit. So again, we're covering the entire bottom half of that shank, and you can see this tail wants to spin a little because we don't have a crank down mentality when we're tying this. And if you need to give this a name, since we're working with a Polliwog tail, I think you could absolutely call it a two-timing Polliwog tail. Since we're adding some elements here, clip that out. And at this point, I'll turn it, and you can see everything that's going on. We still have that needle protruding. This is able to be moved at this point still, and then we have the very tag end of our polliwog tail. So now, let me just make this a little bit cleaner. And I'm going to finish wrapping this down. And then come one more pass up and one more pass back. Now, this part is where, if there's a little trickery, I guess this would be it. What I don't want to do is leave myself too far out on this little nub, so consider that not used. However, let's start moving these fibers back. Brush gently, because remember, there's one section wherever that thread is hanging that you're going to have to be careful and mindful of those fibers, so that as we get to here, we're just going to take a loose pass over with our offhand, never letting go of this pinch, and now we can let go on the second pass. So that little nub that we had is covered. It's not going to offend anybody, including the fish, and that's kind of the important part. So now I'm going to just work back and get a nice thread neck layered in there, and now I can whip finish. And if there's a key to doing this with, this is not a super long tail, so this shouldn't be too difficult. If we had twice as much fiber, they do make a whip finisher that's extended, and that helps somewhat. But I'm going to show you today, if you don't have too much pressure in your hands, you can do this with a standard whip finisher and tie this off and whip finish. So here would be the normal wrap, but because there's no extra tension in this left hand, I can pull that as far as I need to, and that's going to allow me to clear on every pass. If you're able, just gently coax any of those trap fibers out. We got two more wraps there, 1 and 2, and before I pull that whip finish all the way up to the neck, just try to get those fibers out. There's one. We're going to make a second whip finish. Again, really extending past it to make sure we don't trap any fibers. Wrap number 1, 2, 3, and 4. No fibers trapped in the tail. Nice little snug pull on your thread and trim out any of that. And so now what we're going to be left with is a tail with a contrasting tail. So this tail is going to kick off the end of the fly, and then as that kicks, this second tail will kick the opposite direction, and this thing just will not sit still. At this point, go ahead and add some head cement of your choice. Super glue would also work, or Zap-A-Gap. Any of those are great options. One thing I will tell you is if you're using hardhead clear like I am from Loon, it does take a little bit longer to dry. Be patient. Maybe tie 6 tails up and let them dry off to the side, and by the time you finish the 6th one, grab your first one and you're ready to tie. And that's also a good way to improve your skills, become more consistent. Fly to fly is to tie a number of them at a time instead of just one at a time. All right, and there we go. This has all the elements of just insane movement and everything else. So here I'm going to use my offhand or left hand. I'm going to get my thumbnail right against this needle shank. I'm going to actually brace the needle and then just push off toward the back, and voila, there's our 2-timing polliwog contrasted color tail. Now we can get rid of the needle, and what we're going to pop in the vise now is the new Ahrex SA254. This is a size 4, and you guys have heard us talk a little bit about this hook. We collaborated with Ahrex, and Josh had a lot of influence in, as far as I know, the first saltwater jig hook to be produced, and this thing is nasty. It works so well. So we've got a Spawn super bead in there, a little pink, and we're looking for some 0.015 non-lead weighted wire. I'm going to get maybe a dozen wraps of this wire on there. We're not looking to add a bunch of weight because that bead is already doing that for us. And let me get a scissor here, and we'll cut front end around that where we cut, and do the same thing on the back end of the wire, and use the curved or flat edge of whatever scissor you've got in your hand and just roll that over, and it won't cut your thread immediately when you start to put thread on this thing. So now we want this meaty portion, not the slotted portion, we want the meaty portion underneath the hook, because that's going to give us the best upturned hook point money can offer. Keep the weight underneath that shank at all costs. Here we go, let's start our thread behind those weighted wires. Like so. Alright, when we go to wrap these wires down now to secure all the bead positioning and everything else, that just slicked all the way in there. Pop it out just a touch. There we go. What I'm going to do is make some angled wraps forward, 45-degree angle, and then I'm going to go the opposite 45-degree angle on the way back. And these are just going to position where that wire is. You see how that bead just wants to spin a little bit after 2 or 3 passes of this thread. It should get a little buildup of a thread dam there behind it. We're not going to stress on that because we do have more coverage that we want to attain. All we want to make sure is as it starts to get some tension, make sure that beefy portion is on the underside of your shank. And looks okay right now. Let's add one more pass. Really get some thread wraps behind that bead. Now you can see the slot is on top, the beefy portion underneath, and this thing is not going anywhere, and it's going to ride hook point up all day long. Alright, so now my thread's at the farthest back portion of the flat section of that shank. I'm going to come up just a few wraps. So now let's take our little polliwog tail here, and just using your eyes, go ahead and imagine this entire section being 1.5 to 2 times the hook shank length. And a couple positioning wraps. Make sure when you're tying these tails in that it stays all on one side of the hook. And so for this fly we're going to be using a loop with a different material, so it will cover as far as a circumference look and even coverage. But as far as placing this tail, make sure if you're, like I'm using the bottom of this hook, all of that material is underneath and it's on the bottom of that hook shank. And then from there it's just tie down and keeping all that stuff nice and neat as much as you can. I'm pretty happy with that. So from here we're going to prepare for our loop. So bring the thread down, grab with your offhand finger, come back, couple wraps forward, couple wraps back to our original point. We're going to go once, twice, 3 times around the thread and come back up. That makes a little knot for us, and then we'll come back one more time with the thread and position that knot so it cannot move forward. 1 wrap behind, and now the knot cannot move backwards. And at this point we can advance our thread to right behind the bead. For our dubbing that's going to be put into this loop, we've got some spawn, and this is UV hot pink spawn Simi seal, and I'm just going to slick that into that loop, and we are looking at roughly 2.5 inches of a stack of fibers, and these are all very sparse. We're not going for anything dense here. The thinner you can go on this body, the more effective this type fly will be. So I do have my spinner in the bottom of the loop now. Let's just spin this up real quickly. And once it's where it needs to be, we've got our little brush here from the Swiss CDC folks, and maybe one of my favorite tools, at least in the last year or so. Really get in there, brush out all those loose fibers that you don't need, leave them in the brush for now, And a couple more spins there, good to go. As we're wrapping this, I'm just going to coax all those fibers toward the rear before I make each wrap. This is about as simple as it gets for tying a little worm fly. You could absolutely crush a Polliwog worm by using this little technique we've got going here. Any leech, anything that just needs to slither and move, and we're already right behind the bead. One more wrap of what was the loop to make sure we can keep all the fibers going toward the back. And now one last wrap up, and I'm going to use that V right like so to get my thread in there. So I want 3 good wraps to solidify where that loop is, and then we'll bring the tag end back and wrap over it again. And I know a lot of you, if you watch our social medias, Instagram, Facebook, and follow us on YouTube and all that, you may have noticed that a certain guy that's here named Josh Phillips catches a lot of fish, namely a lot of steelhead and salmon species. And I'm pretty sure once he sees this little fly, it's going into his steelhead box. Form a nice little thread head neck, if you will, and we're ready for our 2 whip finishes. And there's one more fly that is ready to land a gnarly steelhead. There's one. 4 wraps per. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Nothing to it. Cut that out of there, and we can head cement this bad boy. Before I head cement this, let's brush this guy out real quickly again. Make sure none of those fibers are trapped inside that body, because with Simi seal, it does move and breathe, it expands, it contracts compared to the way you strip and pause when you're retrieving your fly. And so we want it to have every advantage possible that's already built into the material. Why won't you just let it do what it does? Brush those back. It's looking beautiful like that. So now we can cement all these thread wraps here. And I'll caution you to not get a bunch of cement into that Simi seal, because it'll just mat it down and remove those breathing properties that we just talked about. If you do get a little bit in there, it's not the end of the world. Do not try to remove it, because it'll just spread it into all the other fibers. So just let it dry, trim out if it's really bugging you. Chances are it's going to fish just fine. Steelhead, you know, they're still working on learning proper English skills, so I don't think they're going to yell at you. And there we have it. So let me get this out of the vise for you guys here. I mean, one fiber. Don't like that one. There we go. And there you can see, even in the vise, it's not going to sit still, and that's a good omen for what we're looking for. So there you go. We've got a blue tail, pink hotspot in the tail, to the Polliwog tail, and to the SA254 jig hook saltwater series with Spawn Super Bead in the front. I don't know what else to give you guys as far as advice, except once this hits the water, make sure you used a good knot and you brought a big net. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember to hit like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments if there's something else you want to see us tie, or just hit us up with anything you think would help. We really appreciate you guys watching this, and we will see you on the water.